Tomorrow, the UPA will mark 3 years in office. Today, we discuss a speech given by Shankar Aiyar to the Confederation of Indian Industry, which some have interpreted as a critique of the government. Minister, in your speech to the CII in April, you said that whilst the masses determine who will rule India, the classes determine the policies of the government. Are you suggesting that the government's policies are not always in the best interest or in the complete interest of the majority of the people of the country?
Sometimes. But frankly, that was not my remark. I was quoting Shekhar Gupta, and I was very impressed with that remark, which he made in an article about 10 years ago.
But you were endorsing it. You weren't distancing yourself.
I have no doubt about it.
So this reflects your thinking?
Well, I think this is not particular to my government. It's true of all governance.
Absolutely. And therefore, inherent in this remark was also another thought. You were suggesting that on critical development policies, elite institutions like the CII have an undue influence on the government's thinking.
Yes. And I was also suggesting that if we are aware of this, then we can always take countervailing action. But I was present, the speech was made extempore in a CII forum, and they were discussing specifically the issue of what are the new issues that they should take up. And the man who had introduced the subject had boasted about how influential they'd been on economic reforms.
And in a sense, you were acknowledging that, but pointing out that this was a distortion of the interests of the majority because the CI didn't represent the majority.
In fact, specifically, I said that since they are an industry association, it's not surprising that they are advocating industry interests, but industry interests need not necessarily be the country's interest.
And there was something else that was also inherent. You were also suggesting, although you didn't say it so openly, that the Aam Aadmi, despite the rhetoric about him, is not always at the center of all the policies of government.
And he ought to be. And the whole point of what I was trying to say was that we ought to constantly remind ourselves of the National Common Minimum Program's commitment to the Aam Aadmi. And if there were a conflict between the growth rate interest, the interests of the growth rate, and the interests of the Aam Aadmi, we should take both into account before we take a decision.
Let me quote from your CII speech. You said, "Come into the cabinet and see what happens. The minute suggestions are made as to what would perhaps be for the benefit of the people and what would be of benefit to the classes, the tendency is to say our great achievement is 9.2%. Our great achievement is Indian industrialists are buying Arcelor and Chorus. Our great achievement is that India has become the theme at Davos." What you seem to be suggesting is that some members of the cabinet are more concerned about boosting India's international image than taking the hard decisions necessary to help the majority.
Yeah, my point was really to underline that there can be a conflict between the demands of growth and the demands of equity.
Not can, but is.
This is not always so. This is quite often so. And when it is, I wanted to tell the Confederation of Indian Industry that if we are framing an economic policy for a democratic polity, as we have to, then we must resist the tendency to look at the interests of the classes and instead take into account the interests of the masses.
But absolutely, and in fact you went a stage further because you said, come into the cabinet and see, and when this divide happens in the cabinet, people tend to argue in favor of policies that boost India's international standing rather than policies which are difficult but would help the poor.
Well, I gave one specific example. I was building up to that example.
In fact, that example was a very telling example. You said that when it's a question of spending 648 crore on village development, it's considered too expensive. But when it's a question of 7,000 crore for the Asian Games, it's a matter of national pride. The Commonwealth Games, it's a matter of national pride.
Yeah, well, that was the argument that was put before me.
By a cabinet minister.
You know, why do you want to pin me down on this? You know that that is so. I don't wish to say so.
All right. But what lies behind this divide, in a sense, is that the priorities are misplaced, perhaps even wrong.
The priorities could get misplaced, is my point. I was trying to illustrate a general tendency towards allowing the classes to determine what our economic policy should be, when actually we ought to be all the time very conscious of the demands of the masses.
And in fact, that was the point you made explicitly. You said, and you quoted Gandhiji, that policies are no longer judged in terms of how they would affect the lives of the poor. That consideration, which Gandhi had said should be at the forefront of Indian governments, seems not to be a concern today.
Yeah, the specific quotation from Gandhiji is known as the talisman quotation, where Gandhiji says that I'll give you a talisman. When you are in doubt, summon up the poorest person that you know to your mind and ask yourself whether what you propose to do is going to benefit him. And if it does, then you will discover that all your own doubts will vanish.
Quite right.
And I said that in contrast to this, which was an injunction given to us at independence, the tendency to think that the welfare of the country is measured in terms of the GDP growth rate rather than the components of the GDP growth rates and the beneficiaries of that could mislead us from time to time.
But you were saying something more. You were clearly saying that in fact all governments, but yours, because yours is the government in power for the last 3 years, has not judged policies in terms of how they affect the poor. They've judged policies in terms of how they affect the growth rate.
No, what I was arguing in the CII was that there is a tendency in this direction, which doesn't mean that there isn't a countervailing tendency.
You said that some of the most influential members of the cabinet, and that was an exact phrase that you used, in fact had these mistaken priorities. In a conversation that you related with this unnamed influential minister, you said that he had in effect shot down spending 648 on the Gram Nyay because he thought it was too expensive, but he had no problem with 7,000 on the Commonwealth
What I
Games.
think you should note is that the same cabinet and the same minister which I was referring to actually passed the next day exactly the same proposal with reference to which I was illustrating my general point. What I want you to understand is that there are currents and cross currents in all policy making. And what I was trying to advocate was a conscious decision by the politicians to take into account the masses when the tendency would be to get influenced by the classes.
Are you a lone voice in cabinet, or are there others like yourself?
There are lots of voices that are
like yours, who believe that in fact the Aam Aadmi should be the center and that 9.2% growth ought not to be the main concern?
Let me put it this way. We belong to a government based on the NCMP. And the NCMP's emphasis is on the Aam Aadmi. And the Prime Minister of India, plus the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, have repeatedly said that it is inclusive growth, which should be the theme of the 11th plan.
Well, that's what you're saying, and now in a sense you're moving away from the tone, emphasis and content of your CII speech. There, clearly you were presenting a critique, today you're presenting a defense of the government.
Yes, you must understand that I'm talking to you, then I was talking to the CII, and I had no idea that some cameraman was recording it. When I speak to the
then
CII...
when you had no cameraman recording, you were prepared to be more open. Today when a camera is recording, you're backing off your own openness.
I think you're talking rubbish. I'm talking to you, you're not the CII.
Let me quote to you from that CII speech, because there were certain issues you raised that I'd like to explore with you. You said, everything that goes in the name of good governance, such as economic reform, either doesn't touch the lives of the people or affects them adversely. Advocates of economic reform say that reforms are particularly important for the poor because they cut out corruption and they allow room for individual initiative. Why do you take an opposite view?
Because if you do not have an inclusive definition of good governance, that it should be governance that affects the people at the grassroots. I had particularly in mind Panchayati Raj, the third tier of governance brought in by the longest and most detailed amendment to the Constitution. And I think we need to emphasize questions of governance over questions of resources.
Well, can I ask you quickly, are the economic reforms that have been undertaken by the UPA government, are they designed to help the poor, and have they succeeded, or in a sense have they been designed to encourage 9.2% growth? Into which category do they fall?
They fall into both. And this is what you need to understand. There is a disproportionate benefit of the 9.2% going to the classes. And what I was wanting to emphasize is not that there's no benefit going to the masses,
but change the proportion.
But that it needs to be much more consciously directed there. And for that, it's not a question of resources. It's a question of governance mechanism.
It's something more than that, because you explicitly in your CII speech said that the Indira Awas Yojana and the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana were not only way behind schedule, but were treated as if they were not of great concern and value. You were implying that they exist, in a sense, to appease the conscience of government rather than to really change the lives of the poor.
I can't, you can put whatever words you wish into it, I stick to my own words. The key lack here in both the Indira Awas Yojana and the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana is not only a shortage of resources, but much more that the Panchayati Raj institutions are not being fully used for the planning and development of economic development and social justice
Why aren't
projects.
they being used? Because they should be.
Because this is a state subject and the initiative has come from the center, and my ministry's job is to work out a national consensus, which I think I've succeeded in doing in considerable measure.
But let me quote to you from your speech, because there you suggest a different explanation for why some of these concentration on the poor is not happening. You say, if we take some of the harsh measures required to be able to have some equity in our economy, I fear it's going to have an adverse impact on that rate of growth.
That's true.
Are ministers obsessed with the rate of growth that only applies to a proportion of a country that is a minority, or as a result, are they failing to take tough decisions to help the poor?
I think you are needlessly trying to pit me against the cabinet. These arguments and discussions go on in cabinet as to, for example, if you raise the procurement price, it benefits the farmer. But if the prices go up in the PDS outlets in the open market, then the consumer, who's often the same farmer, is seriously adversely affected. And if in order to moderate this, you raise the rate of interest, the chances are that the GDP rate of growth will be affected.
Absolutely.
So it is, I was drawing attention to the necessity of understanding.
And in your speech, in fact, you concluded this very example by suggesting that, in fact, the government as a result doesn't take the action that will harm the classes and therefore ignores the action that could help the masses.
Well, I think you're wrong there, because what we've actually done is to raise the rate of interest.
But that's not what you said in your CII speech.
And we raised the procurement prices.
Let me come back to how you, in a sense, ended your CII speech. There referring to Gandhi's famous comment that the world has enough to satisfy the need but not the greed of everyone. You said at 9.2% we're racing ahead to satisfy people's greed, but we're neglecting people's need, and this is not sustainable in a democracy.
Absolutely.
What is it that you fear might happen if correct remedial action is not taken?
I fear that a government which is attempting to have an economic policy for the Aam Aadmi may not get the Aam Aadmi's endorsement.
In other words, the Congress-led government could soon become unpopular with the Aam Aadmi because the Aam Aadmi believe it hasn't acted in its interest.
It is our job to understand this at the midpoint, because that's where we are, and to take course corrections in this regard. So, and it is the job of any responsible cabinet minister to not only take into account what our achievements are, but also what further needs to be done.
You're saying something very important. At midpoint, we need to be aware of the fact that if we don't take course correction, we could end up losing the support of the Aam Aadmi.
Absolutely.
So the government is coming close to losing the support of the Aam Aadmi in whose name it actually exists.
We've got another 2 years, and there is time enough to take certain special measures.
But alarm bells should be ringing.
They should be rung. They absolutely should be rung, whether they're ringing or not.
So in fact, this CII speech was an alarm bell that you were ringing, in a sense, even to your Congress fellow men.
The CII speech was to the CII. To my fellow congressmen in cabinet and out of cabinet, I have been stressing the need for us to constantly keep this course correction in mind.
When you make these points to the Prime Minister, as undoubtedly you must have made, what response do you get?
I get a very sympathetic response.
So he understands the time for alarm bells have come.
After all, don't forget that the expression inclusive growth means exactly that.
But you're saying to me the Prime Minister accepts that the time for alarm bell ringing has come.
I think all of us who are responsible hear alarm bells if the rate of growth leads disproportionately to benefit the richer classes. And we must take various types of action to directly benefit the masses.
Let's take a break at that point. I want to come back and ask you, by taking your courage in your hands and speaking out, have you possibly endangered your position in the cabinet? We'll be back in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to Devil's Advocate and an interview with Shankar Aiyar. Shankar Aiyar, by convention, cabinet ministers don't express their disagreement or difference with government priorities or policies in public. In a sense, you've done that both today and in your CII speech. Are you worried that your honesty and your outspokenness might give the Prime Minister cause to ask for your resignation?
I said nothing in my CII speech that I haven't been saying in public over the last 3 years. So I have not taken any courage in anybody's hands.
Priyaranjan Das Munshi has publicly said that Shankar Aiyar should not have broken ranks and he's embarrassed the government.
To you.
But he still said it publicly. He said it on television.
Yeah, because you provoke people to say that kind of a thing. Let me tell you that in the last 1 month that has elapsed since my CIA speech, no one's asked for my resignation. I have received numerous very flattering references to that speech from my own party colleagues. There is not one minister who has come to me and said that, I shouldn't have said it, except for Priyo to you, and that was specifically in the context of the fact that as the president of the Indian Football Association, he's a great advocate of the Asian and Commonwealth.
Don't interpret him. Let's leave his motivation or interpretation out of it. I want to come back to your CII speech.
Yeah,
in your speech, you said, after seeing the impact of economic reforms, you have, and I quote, become a complete Marxist.
Yes.
The Congress is not a Marxist party, so do you increasingly feel a little like a fish out of water?
Yeah, I explained to you, I've been a fish out of water for a long time. This is not the first time I've said that I'm a Marxist, and I explained why I was a Marxist.
But my question is a different one. Do you feel a fish out of water in Congress?
No, sorry, since you want one-word answers, no.
But do the Congress people, your former colleagues, look upon you as one of them? Or do they now, as a result of your expression of disagreement with some of the policies the government is pursuing or its impact, see a difference and a divide?
I'm the only cabinet minister with 3 portfolios.
You're also the only cabinet minister who's publicly spoken about how government policies might not be hitting the Aam Aadmi, who's expressed publicly alarm bells.
I am the author of the Economic Introspection Report. I am the author of a very large number of Congress resolutions on this subject. I have been in the heart of discussion and debate in my party on these issues. I am on the left wing of my party, and it may be news to you, but it's not news to the Congress party.
But today your critique of the government has given a platform to government's other critics to fire off your shoulder and criticize the government.
Yeah.
A.B. Bardhan, Guru Das Gupta have already done so.
And therefore, let me remind you of Kipling's great verse, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, yours is the world and everything that's in it. And what is more, you'll be a man, my son.
But that means you see A.B. Bardhan and Guru Das Gupta as knaves.
They're using these expressions for their purposes.
Let me put this to you. Today, your position in the cabinet seems to be akin to that of a conscientious objector. If the sort of alarm bells you're ringing do not have a response, and the balance does not change more towards the Aam Aadmi and less towards the classes, how long can your position in this government continue?
I'm so glad you described me. I'm very flattered as the conscience keeper. But what I say has a resonance in cabinet. It has a resonance with every single significant minister with whom I've talked about this matter. Nobody has reprimanded me. Nobody has suggested that I'm out of line. No one.
But will you end up having the effect on cabinet policy that you want, or will you be whistling in the wind?
Well, let's see. No, I'd certainly not be whistling in the wind. Probably I will not have as much of an impact as I'd like.
So the alarm bells that you're ringing today won't be heard as attentively and won't be responded to as carefully as they should be.
No, this is a matter of opinion, and in every democratic country, policy parties have a left and a right wing. I am on the left wing.
Shankar Aiyar, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.